I kept standing even when my legs started to ache, because sitting down felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud. The floor was cold and polished, reflecting the harsh white lights above me, and every few seconds the automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical sigh. Each time they opened, my heart leapt forward like a stupid, hopeful thing. Each time they closed, it dropped back into my chest a little harder than before. I told myself not to overthink it. I told myself people run late all the time. I told myself airports are confusing, traffic is unpredictable, phones die. Things happen. I said all of this in my head like a prayer, repeating it until the words started to lose meaning. I kept my eyes locked on the doors, as if staring hard enough could summon her into existence. My phone buzzed in my hand, and for half a second, relief washed over me so fast it almost made me dizzy. But it wasn't her. Just a notification. Something pointless. I unlocked the screen anyway. My thumb hovering, trembling just a little. I checked the call log again, even though I already knew what it would say. Missed call. Missed call. I counted them slowly, like counting steps while walking through a dark room. 12. I had called my mom 12 times. The number felt unreal, like it belonged to someone else's story, not mine. I stared at her name on my screen, at the small, smiling photo I had chosen years ago, back when that smile meant safety. Back when it meant certainty. I dialed again, even though a quiet voice inside me whispered, "Don't." I put the phone to my ear and listened to it ring. 1 ring, 2, 3. Each ring stretched longer than the last, pulling something tight inside my chest. I imagined her phone lighting up somewhere, imagined her seeing my name and thinking, "I'll call back in a minute." I imagined 100 excuses because the alternative was unbearable. The call went to voicemail. Something shifted then. Not all at once, just a small crack. I lowered the phone and looked around, really looked around, for the first time since I landed. People were moving in every direction, dragging suitcases, laughing, arguing, reuniting. A man wrapped his arms around a woman near the exit, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing. A child ran toward someone yelling, "Mom," with pure, uncomplicated joy. I felt like I was watching life through thick glass, close enough to see it, too far away to touch it. I checked the time. She should have been here an hour ago. An hour is a long time when you're waiting. It stretches. It warps. It fills your head with questions you don't want to ask. I tried to remember the last thing she said to me before I boarded the plane. I replayed it over and over, like rewinding a tape until the sound starts to distort. "Call me when you land," she had said. "I'll be there." Not maybe. Not hopefully. I'll be there. I had believed her without hesitation. That was the part that hurt the most. I sent a text this time instead of calling. Just 2 words. "I'm here." I watched the screen, waiting for those tiny typing bubbles to appear. They didn't. I refreshed the conversation. As if my phone was somehow broken, as if the problem couldn't possibly be that she wasn't responding. My chest felt tight, like I'd swallowed something too big. Another announcement echoed through the terminal, reminding passengers that unattended luggage would be removed. The voice was calm, rehearsed, indifferent. It struck me then how small I was in this massive place, how easily I could disappear into the background noise. No one was looking for me. No one even knew I was waiting. I sat down on my suitcase, finally giving in to the ache in my legs. The vinyl seat was cold through my clothes. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, phone clutched in both hands like it was the only solid thing left. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself to relax. But my heart kept beating too fast, like it knew something my mind was still denying. I glanced at the doors again. Fewer people were coming through now. The rush had slowed, thinned out. The airport felt different, quieter. like it was exhaling after holding its breath all day. Shops were starting to close, metal gates rolling down with final, unforgiving clanks. Time was moving on without me. That's when the thought finally formed, clear and sharp, cutting through all the excuses I had built around it. What if she's not coming? The question landed heavy, settling deep in my stomach. I pushed it away immediately. No, that couldn't be it. She wouldn't just not come. Not without telling me. Not without calling. I shook my head slightly, as if I could physically dislodge the idea. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat. I stood up again, pacing this time, walking a short loop between the seats and the wall. Movement helped keep the panic at bay. I checked my phone again, my thumb moving automatically, muscle memory taking over. Still nothing. No calls. No texts. No missed anything. I imagined her car pulling up any second, imagined her rushing in, flustered, apologizing, explaining. I imagined rolling my eyes and saying it was fine, even though it wasn't. I imagined relief so strong it would make me lightheaded. I clung to that imagined future like a lifeline. But the doors kept opening for strangers, and closing, and opening again. At some point, I stopped imagining her face and started noticing everyone else's. The security guard leaning against a pillar, scrolling on his phone. The janitor pushing a cart slowly, methodically. They all had somewhere to be, something to do. I was the only one frozen in place, stuck in a moment that refused to resolve. My phone battery dipped lower, and the sight of it sent a jolt of fear through me that felt almost ridiculous, as if losing power would somehow make this real, as if as long as my phone stayed alive, there was still hope. I plugged it into a charging station and stood there, watching the percentage creep up, feeling like I was the one being recharged, barely. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen while it charged. I barely recognized myself. My eyes looked tired, older. There was something raw there, something exposed. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, and that's when it hit me fully, finally, with no room left to argue. She wasn't on her way. No traffic delay lasts this long without a word. No dead phone stays dead for hours. No loving promise disappears this completely. The excuses fell apart one by one, and what was left was a truth I had been circling since the first unanswered call. I was alone. Not just in the airport. In that moment, in that realization, I felt my chest cave inward, like something essential had been knocked loose. I wrapped my arms around myself without thinking, a small, instinctive gesture, as if I could hold myself together. The noise of the airport faded into a dull hum, and all I could hear was my own breathing, shaky and uneven. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, staring at the doors, even though I knew, deep down, they weren't opening for me anymore. After I accepted that she wasn't suddenly walking through those doors, something else took its place. Not calm, not clarity. Just this restless, aching need to do something, anything, to make sense of it. My fingers hovered over my phone again, even though I had already promised myself I wouldn't call anymore. That promise lasted maybe 30 seconds. I told myself I wasn't calling to beg. I wasn't calling to accuse. I was calling because there had to be an explanation that didn't hurt this much. I needed to hear her voice say my name. I needed proof that I still existed somewhere outside this terminal. I dialed. The ringing felt louder this time, as if the phone was mocking me. Each ring hit my nerves like a tap on exposed skin. I paced slowly while I waited, counting my steps without realizing it, trying to stay grounded. 1 ring. 2. 3. By the 4th, my chest started to tighten. By the 6th, I was already bracing for the voicemail. When it came, I didn't hang up right away. I listened to the entire greeting, every familiar syllable. Her voice sounded so normal, so present, so wrong. When the beep finally sounded, I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. I hadn't planned what I would say. All the words I'd rehearsed vanished at once. "Hey, Mom." I finally managed, my voice quieter than I expected. "It's me. I'm at the airport. I've been here for a while now. Call me back, okay?" I ended the call and stared at the screen, my reflection faint and distorted. I didn't like the way I looked when I left that message. Small. Careful, like I was afraid of taking up space, even in my own mother's voicemail. A few minutes passed. Then a few more. I checked the time again, then checked it again like it might change if I looked hard enough. Nothing happened. The world kept moving forward without acknowledging the fact that I was unraveling in public. I called again. This time I didn't leave a message. I hung up the second it went to voicemail, my jaw clenched. I felt a strange mix of anger and shame, like I was doing something wrong by reaching out, like I was being annoying, desperate. I hated that feeling. I hated that it existed at all. I sat back down, gripping my phone so tightly my hands started to cramp. I watched the call log grow longer, each missed call stacking on top of the last. Evidence of a one-sided effort. It felt like leaving fingerprints on a door that was never going to open. I sent another text. Then another. "Are you okay? I'm still here. Please call me." Each message was shorter than the last, stripped down to the essentials. I didn't add emojis. I didn't soften the words. I just needed her to respond, to acknowledge me, to say something. Anything. The silence on the other end was loud. It filled the space around me, seeped into my thoughts. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way the lights buzzed faintly overhead, the way the floor smelled like disinfectant, the way my suitcase felt like an anchor tied to my wrist. Everything felt sharper, more intense, like my senses were compensating for the absence of what I needed most. I tried to rationalize it again. Maybe her phone was on silent. Maybe she fell asleep. Maybe something happened. Each maybe was a temporary shield, but they cracked almost as soon as I formed them. Because if something had happened, someone else would have called. If she was asleep, she would have woken up by now. If her phone was on silent, 12 missed calls would have broken through. 12. I counted them again, slowly, deliberately. One for every 10 minutes. One for every time I told myself to stop. One for every excuse I made on her behalf. Seeing the number made my stomach twist. It wasn't just a statistic anymore. It was a timeline of hope slowly collapsing. I imagined her phone lighting up again and again, my name flashing on the screen. I imagined her glancing at it, thinking she'd get to it later. The thought made my chest burn. I didn't want to believe she could ignore me like that. Not intentionally. Not knowingly. But the longer the silence stretched, the harder it became to deny. I tried calling from a different angle, not emotionally but practically. I called a relative. No answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. I stared at the wall afterward, feeling the circle closing in. Every option I reached for slipped through my fingers. I leaned my head back against the cold glass and closed my eyes. For a moment I just breathed. In. Out. In. Out. I tried to slow my heart, tried to quiet the spiraling thoughts. But my mind kept drifting back to the same question, over and over, relentless. Why isn't she answering? I opened my eyes and checked my phone again, even though I knew better. No notifications. No missed calls. The little bars of signal mocked me by being full, as if to say, the connection is there. You're just not worth using it. That's when my thoughts turned darker, more personal. I wondered if I had done something wrong. If I had said something that upset her. If I was being punished in some quiet, passive way. The idea crept in slowly, then settled, heavy and unwelcome. It's amazing how quickly silence can make you blame yourself. I replayed old arguments in my head, conversations that had ended awkwardly, moments when I had felt like an afterthought. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was just stress talking. But the pattern felt familiar, and that scared me more than the airport ever could. I called one last time and let it ring all the way through. I watched the seconds tick by on the screen, counting them without meaning to. When it went to voicemail again, something inside me cracked open. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let the truth seep in. This wasn't an accident. Accidents get corrected. Mistakes get apologized for. Silence gets maintained. I lowered the phone and let it rest in my lap, my hands suddenly feeling empty without the act of calling. I felt exposed, like I had said too much without saying anything at all. The effort I had poured into those calls had nowhere to land. Around me, people continued to arrive and leave. Lives intersected and separated effortlessly. And there I was, stuck in this loop of reaching out and getting nothing back. Learning in real time how it feels when your voice doesn't carry to the person you expect to hear it most. The calls stopped not because I got an answer, but because I ran out of hope to fuel them. When the calls stopped, the quiet rushed in to take their place. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that presses against your ears until you're forced to listen to your own thoughts. I hadn't noticed how much noise the airport made until that moment. Wheels rolling, distant announcements, footsteps echoing, because suddenly all of it felt very far away, like I was underwater. I sat there with my phone dark in my lap, my fingers still curved around it, as if it might ring if I held on tightly enough. My body didn't know what to do next. I had built every plan around the assumption that someone was coming for me. Without that, I felt unfinished, like a sentence cut off in the middle. The seats around me were mostly empty now. A few travelers slept curled up with jackets pulled over their faces. Others stared at screens with the same hollow look I imagined was on mine. It struck me then that isolation doesn't always mean being alone. Sometimes it means being surrounded by people who are just as unreachable as the one person you need. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, suddenly aware of how cold the air conditioning felt against my skin. The temperature hadn't changed, but I had. Everything felt sharper now. Every draft, every sound, every second passing. Time moved differently, stretching and dragging, refusing to hurry just because I was uncomfortable. I checked the time again and did the math automatically. The last bus would be gone. Ride options would be limited. The practical worries crept in, piling on top of the emotional ones. Where would I go if I stayed too long? How long could I sit here before someone asked questions? The airport, once a place of transition, started to feel like a holding cell. I watched a cleaning crew move methodically through the terminal, wiping down surfaces that no one would touch for hours. Their routine was calm, practiced. I envied that. They knew exactly where they were supposed to be. I didn't. I felt suspended between places, between expectations, between the version of myself who had arrived confident and the one who was now quietly unraveling. My stomach growled, the sound loud in the near silence. I realized I hadn't eaten since before the flight. Hunger felt distant, secondary, like an inconvenience rather than a need. Still, I walked to a vending machine and stood there for a long moment, staring at the rows of snacks without seeing them. The prices felt insulting. The choices felt meaningless. I pressed a button at random and waited as the machine clunked and dropped something I didn't really want. I sat back down and ate slowly, mechanically, chewing without tasting. I watched the crumbs fall onto my lap and brushed them away with a detached sort of care. It felt strange to perform such normal actions in a moment that felt anything but normal, like pretending everything was fine might somehow make it true. That's when the loneliness shifted into something heavier. It wasn't just about being stranded anymore. It was about the realization that no one was looking for me. No one was worried. If I disappeared into this airport tonight, it might take a while before anyone noticed. The thought wrapped itself around my chest and squeezed. I scrolled through my contacts, not because I intended to call anyone, but because I wanted to see names. Proof of connection. Proof that my life extended beyond this moment. I stopped on a few, hovering, imagining the conversations that would follow if I reached out. The explanations. The pity. The questions I didn't want to answer. I locked the phone again. I rested my head against the wall and closed my eyes. For a second, I imagined what it would feel like to cry openly, to let it all out right there. The idea was tempting, almost comforting. But the tears wouldn't come. Instead, there was just this deep, hollow ache, like something essential had been scooped out and left empty. My thoughts drifted, uninvited, to other moments. Times when I had waited before. Times when I had been the one adjusting, accommodating, understanding. I saw patterns I hadn't wanted to see before, lines connecting moments I had dismissed as isolated incidents. The airport felt like a spotlight, illuminating everything I had tried to keep in the dark. I realized then that isolation isn't sudden. It builds quietly, over years, through small disappointments and unreturned efforts. This moment wasn't an exception. It was a culmination, and that understanding hurt more than the waiting ever could. I opened my eyes and looked around again. The terminal looked different now, almost unfamiliar. The bright signs and glossy floors felt artificial, like a stage set after the audience has gone home. I felt like an extra who had missed their cue, left behind when the scene changed. A security guard walked past and glanced at me for a second longer than necessary. I straightened instinctively, suddenly self-conscious. I didn't want to look like a problem. I didn't want to draw attention. The need to be unobtrusive, to not cause inconvenience, surfaced automatically. It made me angry at myself, even as I obeyed it. I stood up and walked a short distance, just to feel my legs move, just to remind myself that I still could. My footsteps echoed softly, and I focused on the sound, on the rhythm, grounding myself in something tangible. I passed closed storefronts, darkened screens, empty counters. The airport was winding down, preparing to sleep. I wasn't. I found a quieter corner and sat again, tucking my suitcase close like a shield. I checked my phone one more time, not with hope this time, but with resignation. Still nothing. The screen stared back at me, blank and unforgiving. That's when the isolation became complete. Not dramatic. Not explosive, just a calm, sinking certainty that I was on my own tonight. That no last-minute apology or sudden explanation was coming to rescue me from this feeling. The world hadn't ended. No alarms were blaring. But something inside me had shifted permanently. I hugged my knees to my chest and stared at the floor, tracing invisible patterns in the tile. I focused on my breathing again, counting each inhale and exhale, anchoring myself in the present. This was happening. I was here. I would have to figure it out, and in that quiet, empty stretch of time, surrounded by strangers and fluorescent light, I learned how loud isolation can be when it finally stops pretending to be temporary. At some point, fear stopped being sharp and became dull, like an ache you carry after the worst part has already passed. That's when survival kicked in. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet, practical kind that happens when you realize no one is coming to save you, and you still have to get through the night. I checked my wallet, counted the cash twice, slow and careful, as if the numbers might change if I rushed. I calculated options in my head, ride shares, buses, taxis, each one more expensive or less available than the last. Every choice felt like a compromise I shouldn't have had to make. Still, I made them, because standing still wasn't an option anymore. My phone battery was hovering in that uncomfortable zone where you start rationing usage, dimming the screen, closing apps, treating every percentage point like it matters more than it should. I found another charging station and sat there longer this time, guarding my spot like it was territory. The cable felt flimsy, unreliable, but it was all I had. I watched the percentage climb slowly and told myself to breathe, inhale, exhale. I reminded myself of small truths. I was safe. I wasn't hurt. I had money. I had time. Repeating them didn't erase the hurt, but it kept the panic from swallowing me whole. Sometimes survival is just listing facts until your emotions stop arguing. Hunger returned, louder this time. Not just physical hunger, but the kind that comes from depletion. I bought another snack, something warm this time, and wrapped my hands around it just for the comfort. The heat seeped into my fingers, grounding me. For a moment, that was enough. I scanned the room again. Not for her, but for familiarity. I noticed other people who looked like they'd been there too long, their belongings spread out in careful circles. We didn't speak, but there was a strange, unspoken understanding between us. We were all waiting for something that wasn't happening. I adjusted my suitcase to use it as a backrest and settled into a position that wouldn't wreck my spine by morning. It felt wrong to make myself comfortable in a place that represented being left behind, but my body didn't care about symbolism. It just wanted rest. My mind wandered in uncomfortable directions. What if this became a pattern? What if this night wasn't an exception, but a preview? The thought scared me more than the airport ever could. I pushed it away and focused instead on immediate needs. Water. Rest. A plan. I opened my notes app and started writing things down. Not feelings, logistics, bus times, numbers, addresses. Writing gave me a sense of control, however thin. It reminded me that I was capable of problem solving, even when my emotions were wrecked. A janitor passed by and nodded at me. I nodded back, grateful for the acknowledgement. It was small, insignificant, but it reminded me I still existed in the world. That I wasn't invisible, even if I felt forgotten. I leaned my head back and stared at the ceiling, watching the lights blur slightly. Exhaustion crept in, heavy and unavoidable. My body wanted to shut down, but my mind refused to follow. Every time my eyes closed, my thoughts rushed in, replaying unanswered calls, half-formed excuses, the sound of her voicemail greeting. I opened my eyes again. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and fractured. I drifted in and out, waking at every announcement, every rolling suitcase, every sudden noise. Each time I woke, there was a brief moment of confusion, a flicker of hope. Then reality settled back in, heavy and unyielding. I checked my phone every time I woke up. Still nothing. By then, something inside me had hardened. Not in a bitter way, but in a protective one. I stopped waiting for the screen to light up. I stopped imagining apologies. I focused instead on getting through the next hour, then the one after that. Morning crept in slowly, announced by subtle changes. The terminal growing busier, lights seeming harsher, the air feeling less stagnant. With daylight came a strange sense of clarity. The worst had already happened. I had made it through the night. I stood up, my muscles stiff, and stretched carefully. I felt older than I had the day before, like the airport had aged me in invisible ways. I gathered my things and took a deep breath, steadying myself. I looked around one last time before moving on. The place that had felt so overwhelming hours ago now felt almost ordinary. Not because it was less painful, but because I had adapted to it. Survival does that. It dulls the edges just enough for you to keep going. As I walked toward the exit, I realized something quietly powerful. I had taken care of myself when no one else did. I had made decisions, endured discomfort, faced the truth of being alone, and I was still standing. It wasn't the lesson I wanted to learn. It wasn't the way I wanted to learn it. but I learned it anyway. And as much as it hurt, there was something grounding about knowing that even when I was forgotten, even when every call went unanswered, I could still find a way forward. When the phone finally rang, it didn't feel the way I had imagined. There was no rush of relief, no release of tension, no sense of being saved. It was almost jarring how ordinary it sounded, that familiar vibration against my palm, as if it had no idea how much weight it carried. I stared at the screen for a long second before answering, my heart beating not faster, but heavier. Her name filled the display. I picked up, already tired. She sounded surprised, almost amused, like this was an inconvenience she'd just noticed. She didn't ask where I was. She didn't ask if I was okay. She said my name, then laughed softly, the way people do when they realize they've made a small mistake. "Oh my God," she said. I forgot. The word landed wrong. It echoed in my head, bouncing around until it felt too big to contain. Forgot. Not lost track of time. Not something came up. Forgot. As if I had slipped her mind the way a grocery item does. I waited for the rest of the sentence. For the apology. For the panic. For anything that would tell me this mattered to her. But instead, she kept talking, explaining her day, listing distractions, filling the space with reasons that felt painfully light compared to what I had been carrying all night. I listened in silence, my mouth slightly open, my chest hollow. It felt like watching someone else's life from a distance. I responded automatically, nodding even though she couldn't see me, murmuring small acknowledgments that didn't mean anything. My voice sounded calm, detached. I barely recognized it. She asked, almost as an afterthought, if I had gotten home. That was the moment something inside me finally snapped into focus. No. She didn't know. She hadn't wondered. She hadn't checked. I told her I was fine. The lie came easily. Too easily. I didn't describe the hours. I didn't mention the calls, the messages, the waiting. The way the airport lights had burned into my eyes. I didn't tell her how close I had come to breaking down in public. I swallowed all of it, the way I always had. She apologized then, quickly, lightly, like ticking a box. Said she felt bad. Said it wasn't intentional. Said these things happen. Each sentence made the truth clearer, sharper. This wasn't a tragedy to her. It was a scheduling error. I ended the call not long after, my hand steady, my goodbye polite. When the line went dead, I didn't stare at the phone. I didn't feel the urge to call back. I just sat there, breathing, letting the quiet return. And in that quiet, the realization finally settled in. This wasn't just about that night. It was about every time I had waited. Every time I had adjusted my expectations. Every time I had made myself smaller to keep the peace. The airport hadn't created this feeling. It had exposed it. I replayed the call in my head, not obsessively, but carefully, like examining something fragile to understand where it cracked. Her tone. Her laughter. The absence of urgency. All of it told me what I needed to know, even if the words didn't. She hadn't forgotten me just that night. She had forgotten to consider me. That truth hurt in a different way than abandonment. It was quieter, more surgical. It cut away the excuses I had relied on for years. It left behind something raw but clear. I felt grief then, unexpectedly strong. Not for the night itself, but for the version of the relationship I thought I had. For the belief that I mattered in the ways that count. Letting go of that belief felt like losing something that had kept me warm for a long time. I thought about confronting her, about laying everything out, about demanding acknowledgement. The words formed in my mind easily enough, but I knew how that conversation would go. I knew the defenses, the minimization, the way my feelings would be reframed as overreactions. I was suddenly very tired of explaining myself to someone who wasn't listening. So instead, I sat with the truth. I let it hurt. I let it rearrange things. I realized that exposure doesn't always come with drama or shouting. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a single sentence, spoken without malice. Sometimes the most devastating truths are delivered casually. The night at the airport became a line in the sand I hadn't known I needed. On one side was the hope that if I just waited long enough, tried hard enough, I would be prioritized. On the other side was the acceptance that I had been carrying that relationship on my own. I didn't hate her. I didn't even feel angry in the way I expected to. I felt something steadier, more resolved. A recognition of limits, of reality. I saw myself more clearly. Too, I saw how quickly I had taken responsibility for her absence, how instinctively I had protected her from my own disappointment. That awareness stung, but it also felt like a step toward honesty. When I finally stood up to leave, I felt lighter in a strange way. Not because things were better, but because they were clearer. The confusion had been worse than the truth. That call didn't bring closure. It brought understanding. And once you understand something like that, truly understand it, you can't go back to not knowing. After that night, nothing exploded. There was no confrontation that changed everything in one dramatic moment. No apology that fixed what had broken. Life kept moving, quietly, stubbornly normal, and that almost made it harder. Because when something shifts inside you, and the world doesn't acknowledge it, you're left carrying the weight alone. I went home and unpacked my bag slowly, deliberately, like I was handling evidence. Every folded shirt felt like proof that the trip had ended, but something else had begun. I placed my phone on the table and noticed how often I glanced at it out of habit, still expecting it to hold something for me. It didn't. And that realization followed me from room to room. In the days that followed, my mom acted the same. Casual, familiar. She spoke to me like nothing significant had happened, like I hadn't spent a night in an airport wondering if I mattered. She asked normal questions. She talked about her day, and every word felt strangely distant, like it was coming from behind glass. I responded the way I always had, polite, measured, careful. But something was different. I wasn't reaching as much. I wasn't filling silences. I wasn't bending myself to fit into the space she left. I noticed it first in small ways. I didn't call as often. I didn't rush to reply. I let gaps exist without trying to smooth them over. At first, the guilt was overwhelming. It felt wrong to pull back, like I was being ungrateful or cold. I questioned myself constantly. Was I being unfair? Was I holding on to something I should have let go? Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. The instinct to excuse, to forgive before being asked, to prioritize her comfort over my own, rose up automatically. But then I remembered the airport. I remembered the hours of silence, the unanswered calls, the way I had sat there, shrinking into myself, trying not to be a burden, and the guilt softened. Not because it disappeared, but because it finally had competition. I started setting boundaries without announcing them, not as punishment, not as revenge, just as protection. I stopped sharing things that made me feel exposed. I stopped expecting emotional safety where there wasn't any. I adjusted my expectations to match reality, and as painful as that was, it was also freeing. The consequences showed up slowly. She noticed the distance before she understood it. She asked if something was wrong. I told her I was tired. That wasn't a lie. I was tired of hoping. Tired of being surprised by disappointment. Tired of pretending certain things didn't hurt. There were moments when I almost explained everything. When I almost said, "That night changed me." But every time I imagined the conversation, I felt myself closing instead of opening. I realized that not every truth needs to be spoken to be honored. Some truths are for you, not for the person who caused them. I became more self-reliant in ways I hadn't planned. I made backup plans. I stopped assuming help would arrive on time. I trusted my own ability to adapt, because I had already proven that I could. The airport became a reference point, a quiet reminder of what I was capable of when I had no choice. At the same time, I grieved, not loudly, not publicly, but in the private moments when something good happened, and my first instinct was to share it with her. In the moments when I hesitated, then chose not to, that grief was real, and I let myself feel it instead of pushing it away. Our relationship didn't end. It changed shape. It became more limited, more surface level, more cautious. And that loss was something I had to mourn, even though she was still very much alive. That's a kind of grief people don't talk about enough. The grief of realizing someone can only meet you partway. The consequences extended beyond her. I became more aware of how I showed up in other relationships. I noticed when I was over-giving, over-explaining, waiting too long for people who weren't coming. The airport had tuned my sensitivity to absence, and I started paying attention. I also became kinder to myself. In quiet ways, I stopped blaming myself for needing reassurance. I stopped telling myself I was too much for wanting to be remembered. I reframed that night not as a failure, but as information. Painful, necessary information. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that version of me, sitting on the cold airport floor, phone in hand, heartbreaking silently. I want to reach back in time and tell them they're not stupid for believing. They're not weak for hoping. They're not wrong for expecting care from a parent. But I also want to tell them that night will not destroy you. It will shape you. It will strip away illusions you were using to survive and replace them with something sturdier. Self-trust. I learned that love without reliability leaves scars. That being forgotten once can echo far beyond a single moment. But I also learned that survival isn't just about getting through the night. It's about what you carry forward and what you choose to leave behind. I don't tell this story to shame anyone. I tell it because silence protected the wrong person for too long. Because there are people listening who have sat in their own version of that airport, waiting for someone who never came. If there's one consequence that matters most, it's this: I no longer abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable. I don't sit quietly in emotional terminals anymore, hoping someone will notice I'm missing. I notice. And that has changed everything.